Welcome into Kitchen Talk Pickleball Edition. I'm your host, Caitlin Miller, and this week joining us is Dr. Tess Kilwein. She's a clinical and sports psychologist, but I also know her on the pickleball court. So thank you so much for joining us, Tess.
Thanks for having me.
So obviously, first tell me, obviously you have a great background in sports psychology, but when did you start actually playing pickleball and really getting into the sport?
Yeah. I think like a lot of others, I found it during COVID. So during a time that there just weren't many options for athletic activities, especially indoors, that my friend group and I, we found pickleball is just something to do outdoors, right? And pretty quickly then I got more on the competitive side of it and started doing tournaments.
And so, just like on a personal basis, how do you feel that pickleball has been for your mental and physical health?
Yeah. I think wonderful. Just like all sports, right? So all sports have benefits for our physical and mental health, but they can also have detriments, right? If we start to develop any kind of, mental challenges or things like that. But for me, just on a social aspect, I think that's part of it. It's really good for social health, being active with other people, getting support from other people, and our physical health, right? And so getting moving has benefits on just managing our stress levels and, everything that we need mentally. So lots of benefits.
And I know you work with a lot of athletes right at Vanderbilt.
I do, yes.
So, do you notice, like, I've always wondered this, just different like trends within different sports, just in terms of like mental performance
Yeah.
and how that really impacts different athletes?
Absolutely. I think some of our more individualized sports have unique, mental performance concerns that we want to manage. So tennis is a great example that relates a lot to pickleball. So I do work with our tennis teams here, and it's such a mental game, right? Because it's kind of you out there while you're operating as a team. In the moment, it's you or just your doubles partner. So that creates a lot of opportunity for performance anxiety, for any kind of challenges to enter in that space. So I would compare pickleball and just kind of our racket sports in general, high levels of performance anxiety, lots of need for mental rehearsal, lots of need for mental performance strategies. A similar sport would be like the golfers, right? And so again, you're kind of out there on your own. There's a lot of time to think negatively, a lot of time for performance anxiety to enter. So it is those more individualized sports that we tend to see higher levels of the need for mental performance strategies.
When I think unlike soccer or like football, when you have a ton of subs, let's say you're having a bad game because everyone will, you can sub out and have, another person go in. But with pickleball, it's either you on the court, like you said, or you and your partner. And so you don't get that opportunity, which I feel like puts a lot more pressure on the athletes.
That's so true. And one thing we talk about in these sports in particular a lot is mental resets. So when you're faced with adversity, when you're in a high pressure moment of the sport, you might have a timeout, right? There's some strategies, but you don't have the option for someone to come in for you. So it's on you to create that mental reset for yourself, either between points, matches, sets, whatever it may be. You don't have the option of someone coming in and kind of giving a fresh start. You've got to give yourself a fresh start. They're using some of these mental performance techniques like mental resets.
I was going to say, like, let's say, we're in a tournament and we're not playing well, we're off that day. How do you kind of like mentally reset to get yourself back into it and just to try to improve your game as much as possible?
Absolutely. And before I answer that, the key I always tell my athletes is you can't start a mental performance technique in competition. You've got to practice it during practice, right? We wouldn't not, hit a pickleball for 2 months and then go play a tournament. And we do the same thing with mental performance. We think we don't have to address it or do any work on it until it comes competition time. It's hard to pull these things out in those high pressure moments. So what I teach my athletes is just kind of a simple mental reset, right? So if things aren't going your way, you're needing a bounce back. Number one, what you need to do is just stop, take a break, right? So we have a tendency to kind of just push through and rush things. You actually want to stop and take a break. So it could be a timeout. It could be just taking your time to walk to the baseline. It could be having a short conversation with your partner, grabbing a drink, toweling off. So something to stop. Second, you would need to do something that helps relax you. Now, you often don't have a lot of time for this, right? So the easiest, take 1 or 2 deep breaths and just give your body an opportunity to relax and reset. Number 3, a refocus. You need to do something to refocus in that moment. What I often tell my athletes is pick something either verbal or visual and do that same thing every time. So visual mental reset could be something like, where do you look on the court, right? So maybe it's looking at your opponent, maybe it's looking at, a corner of the baseline, something like that, or say something verbally. Easiest one, focus, right? So some people will say, stop, focus, reset, get the next one, whatever it might be for you. There's also a unique one that's more behavioral, right? So I think of like Leah Jansen's serve is one of the best examples of using a physical reset. And so in that moment, you do something physically. It could be, tightening your fist, playing with the strings if you're playing tennis, right? Tapping your paddle, whatever it might be. So find something either visual, verbal, or behavioral that you can do every single time for a mental reset.
Interesting. And then this is stuff like I know you said you can't just start doing those
Yeah.
things like in a tournament. So when you are drilling or something during practice or even just playing rec games, these are things you can start implementing so then when you are at the competition, you're able to actually use them.
Absolutely. And the idea is any kind of mental performance strategy you're wanting to incorporate, you want to do that just as consistently in practice as you do in competition. So if you do it when you're calm or there's less pressure, it's going to be way easier to pull out in those high pressure moments of competition. So think of it like, you're going to go out and drill, you're going to go out and practice your serve. You want to do the same thing for your mental performance techniques. You want to incorporate them every time. And the key here is these things take a couple minutes, right? These aren't like going out and practicing for an hour. It can be a couple minutes before you start your play. It could be just incorporating these mental resets, simple at each serve, in between sets, whatever it might be. So just naturally start to incorporate just one technique at a time into practice so it's easier in competition. I also have to emphasize to people that you can't just start doing 10 mental performance techniques at one time, because then if it changes your game, you don't know what's working or you don't know what's causing a detriment. So these are things you want to incorporate slowly and just one at a time into practice so then they're more feasible in competition.
And I think it's obviously like the most important part of the game because I've seen, the best athletes in the biggest competition just not do well because of their mental game. But I feel like it's something I think more people, have you noticed more people like talking about this side of the game than they used to?
Totally. And I think, on a professional side, we've always known that these sports are highly mental, right? And I think the
Yeah.
athletes do themselves, but there's always been a lot of caution around acknowledging that there's a mental detriment, right? Or something's going on mentally. But the reality is that our mental performance is just as important and plays such a strong role as our physical performance, right? And so I think athletes, especially our higher profile athletes, are being much more vocal about the mental side of sport, which is making it more natural for others to talk about it. So I think of even the US Open, right? So we've got a couple high profile athletes who are acknowledging that, that was the first time I felt like I was competing against myself in an opponent, where I was experiencing this kind of mental challenge, right? And so, yes, I think the conversation about it is increasing, but not doesn't necessarily mean that people are ready to start incorporating that into their practice. And so that's why I try and just normalize it a lot. Just make it one simple technique to start adding. But over time, everybody is out there drilling. Everybody out there has talent. Everybody out there is working really hard. If you want that 1% to 5% edge, that's where the mental performance piece comes in.
And I think just growing up playing a lot of different sports, I always thought, I was mentally tough, but I'll never forget, like, I played my first pickleball tournament. And the scary thing about pickleball is a game, you could be 0-0 at the beginning
Yeah.
and then you could be down 0-5 like so quickly. Like, I feel like it's such a fast game and you can either gain or lose momentum so quickly. And that can really like test your mental toughness
Yes.
because it's like, okay, I'm down like 0-6. Like how, like you really have to, my like reset, I guess what I've been trying to do is be like, okay, like with my partner, let's take it 1 point at a time
Exactly.
and slowly like get back into the game. So then it is a match again. But I just like that was one of the things that kind of shocked me with this
Mhm.
sport is just how quickly you can lose that momentum.
Totally. It's a game of momentum changes, right? And
Yeah.
that can happen really quickly. So another thing I tell my athletes is the mental side of it is focused so much more on the process than the outcome. So we're often thinking about wanting to win the game, win the match, right? Rather than play the point. And so what mental performance does, it asks you to take a step back and just focus on that process and not think about the outcome at all. Because what that does, if you're not thinking about the score, you're not thinking about being down, 5-10, you're just focusing on that one point. It removes some of that anxiety and pressure that comes with a score differential. So I'm reminding my athletes all the time, just play the point. I don't even say win the point, just play the point, take that pressure off. And if we pretend we don't even know the score, we play much more freely, right? It removes
Yeah.
that overthinking, it removes that pressure. So just reminding yourself, just play this point. Don't play to win, don't play to, close the score gap, just play that point freely.
And what's interesting too is like, you work with athletes that have gone, played competitively at high school. I mean, probably since they were like 4 or 5 in that sport. What's a little weird about pickleball, obviously it's changing, but a lot of these pro athletes went from being maybe a tennis player in college or a
Mhm.
soccer player, maybe not even a collegiate athlete. And then they're coming back and they're like playing professionally with pickleball. Do you notice, like, are there any, I guess, does that impact kind of the mental behavior with this sport? Just the thought that they probably played another sport super competitively and then later on in their life or career kind of came back and then pursued pickleball. It's just a unique situation, I guess.
It is, yeah. I think we have so much more variety in athleticism and sport backgrounds on a pickleball court than we do
Yeah.
just about anything else. So there's pros and cons, right? So a lot of our former tennis players have experienced pretty high levels of pressure in sport, sometimes abuse in sport, lots of performance anxiety, right? And that comes to the pickleball court too. So if they don't have those foundational skills and mental performance work, it's just going to be just as challenging on a pickleball court, right? However, if they've accessed resources or they've done a lot of work on their mental game, a tennis player is going to come over to pickleball and be able to face and navigate those challenges in ways that folks who maybe didn't play at a high level before don't have those skills. I also see benefits of coming, without a sport background is maybe you're just having more fun and playing freely, right? So there's pros and
Yes.
cons of kind of coming into the sport and being like, hey, this is fun and I just happen to be really good at it. It removes some of that pressure. So I think there's pros and cons on both sides, and what matters most is how do you develop your mental performance game specific to that sport, right? So pickleball is different than tennis. It's different than soccer. It's different than any former sport. You have to tailor that mental performance strategies to your specific game.
And what about like removing the sport in general and just like something I've always wanted to get into and I haven't, but just kind of calming your overall state like on a daily basis and maybe like meditating or doing other things that aren't necessarily related to the sport, but just in general kind of, lower your heart rate and calm you down quite a bit.
Yeah. And it's the same sort of strategies I would encourage a student athlete or an athlete to participate in, right? So things like mindfulness, meditation, journaling, visualization of positive outcomes. That doesn't happen just on a court, right? But visualizing, I want this talk at work to go really well, or this conversation with a family member, visualizing kind of what the outcome you want. And also visualizing potential negative outcomes, right? How will I navigate this discussion if it goes this way? How will I navigate this challenge if it comes up? So I've always said that, and a lot of people say, right, that sport is a microcosm of society, and it's sort of the same strategies that help us navigate sport environments that are helpful in our daily lives. So sometimes that's leadership skills, that's communication skill building, that's being self-reflective through journaling or just our own processing work that are still going to apply in our daily lives. So, we say sport performance, we say mental performance, but that's not just in sport, right? So mental performance is also a really common strategy in a lot of careers, artists, musicians, athletes, those in the military, right? Executives, leaders, things like that.
Yeah.
So these strategies are not just for athletes, they're for anyone that wants to improve their presence or their focus or optimize the work that they're doing in any space of life.
And what about like sleep or diet? Like, I feel like if you don't get, enough sleep one night, you're easily agitated, and then that kind of like bothers or impacts your mental performance, or you're just not as focused too, which also
Totally.
can impact that as well.
Yeah. I think of sport performance or performance in general as sort of this umbrella term for everything that comes under it. One of those aspects is doing your mental performance work, but there's other aspects as well. So that's our training, right? Our strength and conditioning kind of work that we do. It's our nutrition and our hydration. How are we fueling ourselves for what it needs to accomplish in that day? All of that stuff kind of falls under the same umbrella of performance. Sleep is one of the biggest challenges I face, in particular with young athletes, right? So they need more sleep than someone, at an older age might. And we hear this number of like needing 8 hours of sleep a night, but that doesn't apply to our young athletes. We want our athletes having closer to 9 to 10 hours of sleep. So think of those that we have, competing in pickleball. Travel schedules are just a nightmare, right? So we're flying, we're traveling, we're up early, we're out late, really can disrupt our sleep. And what we know, when sleep goes, so do so many elements of our health and performance. There's research out there, in particular on collegiate tennis players, that those who achieve 9+ hours of sleep at night are able to improve their serving accuracy just because of that sleep change, right? We have the same thing in free throw percentage for basketball, in other sports too. So why we can't necessarily like say sleep one more hour and your serve's going to go up, but what we can say is that all these aspects of our performance are going to improve if we're getting adequate sleep. We think better, we react better, we handle stress better, all those kind of things. So sleep is sort of the baseline for me. That's one of the first questions I ask athletes coming in if they feel like they're experiencing a mental performance challenges. I got to ask you how you're sleeping.
Yeah. And that was one of the things I remember Annalie Waters was asked, like, what's one thing you'd like to see change with pickleball? And it's the fact that there's no off season. So
Yeah.
you said, like, with the travel schedule, I mean, it's insane. Like, they might be based out of Florida, but they're barely in Florida because they're traveling
Mhm.
almost every week. And so it really is hard to even get into any routine when you're always on the road.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that in so many sports now, that there really isn't an off season. Like a lot of our WNBA players, they go play overseas or at a different level in between, right? A lot of our specialized athletes in high school sports, these are year-round club teams and seasons. And the problem with that is a couple things. One, it increases our risk for injury. It
Yeah.
prolongs our recovery, right? So we don't give our bodies a chance to actually recover and bounce back. It increases long-term injury. Overtraining syndrome is common when we're doing kind of these sports year round, right? Which can have both physical and mental health negative adverse effects. And our mental performance, right? So we never get a break. We never get to do anything fun or joyful. And sometimes doing things outside of sport help remind us like sport is something we love and something that we have joy in. So unfortunately, what I see a lot with athletes who kind of get into that overtraining and don't have any breaks is they do lose that joy and the motivation for the sport. That's one of our long-term things that we always watch out for, especially in young athletes. They need these breaks. So I couldn't agree more that we need an off season. We need an off season that's built in for everybody, right? So we can't just say we'll
Yes.
take a week off, because our high performing athletes, they're not going to do that. They want to be competing. So it does need to be more institutional. It needs to be more structural, that we actually give this off season for our athletes to recover both physically and mentally.
And I think what's so sad too is like I grew up playing multiple sports and I did honestly throughout high school, but I feel like there's so much pressure and it's gotten so competitive that these people that want to play D1 sports feel the need to start going year round as early as like the third or fourth grade. And then, like you said, there's so much higher risk for injury and burnout
Mhm.
and all of that stuff. And the climate's changed, which is sad because it's like, and I feel like since I played so many sports, like my body developed like a lot stronger because I
Yeah.
was using different muscles and had different types of endurance and strength. So it's just interesting to see that change.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the research shows is our athletes who do ultimately specialize in one sport are at increased risk of overuse injuries because they're only using certain parts of their body, and they're at particularly high risk of burnout in sport once they get to the college or professional level. And so, especially for our young people, we want them to be navigating different sports, right? It's good for our social development, it's good for our problem solving, it makes us more well-rounded athletes and people. So I get that at some level, right, we're really emphasizing this specialization in sport, but the longer that we can keep young athletes in particular engaging in lots of different sports, it's really going to be beneficial for their social, mental, and physical well-being.
And one thing, I mean, I've honestly learned so much from you, and obviously you're, always like coaching and counseling these athletes. How hard is it for you to actually like implement these tips and tricks like for yourself? I've
I
always
knew you would
wondered
ask
that
this at some point. Yeah.
with
It depends on the day, is what I'll say.
yeah.
Um, Pickleball is such a unique double sport too, in that, like, how many sports do we have that are co-ed in that way? It's just a
Yep.
really unique sport, right? The doubles aspect, the singles aspect. So there's a lot of new challenges for me that I didn't experience when I was competing as an athlete myself, right? It's just a different kind of sport. Um, for me, it's hit or miss, right? So I think what I'm really good at is playing for fun, right? And like taking the pressure off because I know what that can do. I'm also good at taking breaks. So I'm not doing tournaments year round, right? So I'm not, putting that extra pressure on myself. But to say that I don't experience, any kind of performance anxiety in a competition, things like that would be inaccurate. And, I always tell my athletes the goal is not to rid you of performance anxiety or these kind of things. It's how do we reinterpret that arousal as something beneficial? So I'm feeling this anxiety, right? And we tell ourselves it means I'm not prepared or it means things aren't going to go well. Instead, turn that into, wow, I'm excited to get to do this. This is an opportunity that I have, right? So I'm decent at reframing. I'm decent at taking the breaks and just having fun. But when it comes competition time, I think I'm just as susceptible as anybody else.
I know, which is hard to manage because I'll never forget it was like last year I was doing like the Kentucky tournament and
Yeah.
I had not been in like a highly competitive like pickleball tournament in a while. And I just like I remember my partner was like, "Are you okay? Like what's
Yeah.
wrong with you?" Because I just wasn't used to like I feel like our rec play is pretty competitive and we
Yeah.
try to do as well, but then it's like I don't know what it is like mentally when you're actually like at competing again and you haven't competed, let's say for like a few months or
Totally.
even like a year, it's like crazy to get in that
Yeah.
environment again. You have like referees and you're like, oh my
Yes.
gosh, what's going on? It just like
Yeah.
stimulates so much and it is hard to react.
Yeah. And pickleball is unique in that, at the higher levels, we're pretty good about drilling and replicating competition environments, but a lot of people don't, right? A lot of us are
Yeah.
just going out here having fun, laughing, chatting, things like that, which is great for social and mental health, right? But it's difficult to translate into competition, right? So it's a totally different environment when you get into that space. So the more that you can actually replicate a competition environment while you're practicing, the easier it's going to become that time. So
Yeah.
I work with athletes. I would say one of the number one complaints we get with athletes is that I can't translate what I do in practice to competition. I play so much better in practice, and then I start missing these things that I wouldn't in competition. And my response is typically like, how similar do those environments look for you? Are you actually doing your pre-performance routine? Are you using your mental resets? Are you using your positive self-talk in practice? Because if you don't do it then, it's going to be really hard to pull out in competition. I was thinking last night I was helping coach a celebrity pickleball tournament, and what I
Wait,
was
I saw
telling,
that. That
yeah,
looked
yeah,
so fun with Hannah
yeah,
Brown and
yes, yeah.
yes.
And what I told Hannah, we were talking about practice the day before. We were out at McFerrin just doing a lesson and playing, right? And now we're on this rooftop, which is a big crowd and a lot of cameras stuff. And I told her, I'm like, just pretend we're playing out at McFerrin. Nothing's different, right? Nothing actually changes internally. It's just the external stuff. So your skill, your training, your mental strategies are all exactly the same. It's all this external stuff that has changed. So try and remind yourself, same court, same distance, same net height, everything is actually the same. The things that you can actually control are within you. So just focus on those things.
And they ended up doing well. I think they got
Yes, they
second
did. They
place. I
got
saw. I
second. It was
love
tight. Yeah,
that.
they did amazing.
And one of the things too I saw that you published is an article with trauma and PTSD among elite athletes. So I was very intrigued by that. Have you learned from that research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think unfortunately trauma is a lot more common than people often think it is, right? So when we hear trauma, we often think of military trauma or sexual trauma or things like that, but lots of people have experienced traumatic experiences and it may or may not develop into something like PTSD, right? But a lot of athletes have experienced some level of trauma either within or outside of sport. So outside of sport, adverse childhood experiences, things they've been through, family trauma, things like that. And then in sport, experiencing a physical injury, abuse from coaches, things like that. And so there is a lot of trauma in sport, unfortunately. And what we find is that those who have histories of trauma, it can start to impact their mental and physical performance over time if it's left unaddressed. So our athletes are very, very resilient, but they're also kind of told to like rub some dirt on it and just work through it and fight through it, which works to a certain degree until it doesn't. So a lot of what I actually do here at Vanderbilt is I work with student athletes who, have trauma histories. They often come to me for a performance reason, right? Like, I have the yips, or, I can't do as well in competition as I do in practice and things like that. And what I do with everyone I work with is I do a brief trauma assessment to see, is there anything else in your history that might be contributing to this? So what we know is all
Interesting.
these things in our life that, if left unaddressed, start showing up in really unanticipated ways. And what we find is that we can't really teach you a mental performance strategy to just focus on what's on the surface if we don't understand what's at the root. So there's pure mental performance work, and then there's this sports psychology world that involves sort of a combination of both, right? And we do need to unaddress the things impacting our athletes' lives in order to address the mental performance piece next.
That's really interesting. So you obviously like dig deep to find, maybe the root of the problem since they were younger or whatever happened. And then is that something you guys kind of work through like on a counseling level and then kind of build the mental performance? Or do you implement, like, is that something you would tell them to kind of use and reset in a practice situation so that they were good for a competition?
Typically, we would do that processing work more in a counseling space, right? So coming into my office every week, every 2 weeks, whatever it might be, and start engaging in that trauma processing. But we don't ask our athletes to stop sport during that, right? And so you're kind of doing the mental performance pieces of it at the same time. We're not doing a trauma processing session the day before a match, right? So we're really careful about scheduling and just knowing what emotional capacity our athletes have during that week. But the idea is we can't just put a band-aid on it and focus on performance and send you back out there to competition, right? We don't leave our identities or our histories off the court. They come with us. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that work to make them healthy as a person so they can be successful as an athlete in the long term. So it kind of happens at the same time, right? You might be doing some mental performance work while you're also doing some processing. If you're in off season, that's a really great time to do some of this more mental health type of work. It just depends on the athlete.
And going off that too, I mean, there's nothing worse, right, than having like a bad coach or a not supportive teammate. But the one bright side of pickleball is we have the ability to choose our partners.
Yeah.
So, how important or how impactful is it to have a good partner? And what are some of those qualities you should look for? And how detrimental could a bad or negative partner be?
It is crucial. It is absolutely crucial, right? And so that's one of the unique aspects about pickleball, is that we are choosing our partners, and often those partners are co-ed, right? And so one of the biggest things is communication style. So there's got to be some level of agreement. It doesn't even be the same, right? You don't need to communicate the same, but some level of understanding of how do we communicate through challenges? Who is maybe the main communicator when we're out on the court? Who is responsible for calling timeouts? I know like Ben and Anna Lee, he's very clear, like she's the timeout caller, right?
Yeah,
She's in
yeah.
charge. And so some of that, it doesn't always have to be verbal communication, but some level of understanding of like, hey, when do we need a break? When do we need to come back together? Things like that. A second thing that I really think is important, and it may not be for everybody, but the idea of coming together, right? So a simple paddle tap, a simple kind word, a look, things like that is really, really important. Now, there are some athletes that can be silent the whole time with their partner and get through that, but most are not, right? And so having some level of just like togetherness, belongingness with your teammate is going to be really crucial, right? So we see the athletes that are cheering together, or lifting each other up after the game, or paddle tapping and things like that. Super beneficial for our performance. So communication and some level of togetherness are going to be key. The last thing I would say is like, how do we shift and compensate with each other, right? And so, someone's struggling to take this backhand ball, or we're shifting a little bit more, right? So our partner can sort of compensate for that. So it's being flexible and able to adjust our playing styles to accommodate for whatever our partner might be going through. If something's not working well, or one partner's struggling with something, the other one needs to be able to recognize, how might I be able to compensate for some of that?
Yeah, and I think the more you play like in rec player tournaments, you kind of like realize the personalities you like playing with. Like for
Yeah.
me, someone's personality on the court is just as important as they are a player. Like I was just like, there's certain people you mesh with. Like, I personally like calm people, but then, ones that like also celebrate when you're doing well. I just can't deal with people that could be hot-headed.
Yeah,
It honestly it will ruin my mental game for that. Like, I need the calm, like, all right, we're fine. We're going to
yeah.
catch up. Like, we're going to do this, take this one point at a time. It's just interesting. The more you play, the more I've realized, okay, this is what's a healthy partnership for me, and this is how we're going to play the best together.
Totally. And the key is that I think people often make an assumption that if I need this, if this is something that helps for me, it's what I should do for someone else. And
Yeah.
that's not the case at all, right? So understanding what your partner actually needs and then asking for what you need from your partner, right? So some people need a partner that is really energizing, right? And can bring them up. Some people need that calming presence, like you talked about. And so you just find kind of what works for you, and you've got to be able to communicate and work through those things. And I know this is hard, but like recognizing when it's not working is key too,
Yes.
right? Like it's okay to switch a partner. That happens in professional sport all the time, and recognizing like when is it, time to preserve a relationship over a partnership, and when might it be beneficial for both of you to go separate ways.
Well, awesome, Tess. I've learned so much from you. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll stay tuned to see who will join us in the kitchen next time.